The wind howled like a tortured soul, rattling the windows and making the trees outside groan in the storm's violent embrace. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace flickered and cracked, but Emma couldn't shake the creeping sense of unease. She had thought this would be her peaceful escape from the chaos of city life, but now, as the snow piled higher and the storm intensified, she felt something was watching her, waiting. And then a knock at the door. So soft, so hollow, it could only mean one thing. "You're not alone." Emma's car slid to a stop on the narrow, snow-covered road leading to a remote cabin. She couldn't believe how isolated this place was, surrounded by thick, snow-laden trees, with the nearest neighbor miles away. It had taken hours to drive here, and the storm was already starting to pick up. But she didn't care. The cabin was perfect. Cozy, quiet, far from the madness of the world. She wanted to spend the next few days by herself, reading and sipping hot tea by the fire. As the night fell, the world outside became a swirling white abyss. The snow piled up, and the wind screamed through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls. Inside, Emma settled by the fire with a good book, the soft crackling of the flames the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. But then, a faint sound. A tap. 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 She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. It was coming from the front door. She stood up, almost in a trance, and walked cautiously toward it. Her breath quickened as the knocks continued, each tap getting louder and more insistent. When she reached the door, she peered through the peephole. Nothing. The storm outside was a blur of swirling snowflakes, the world hidden beneath a thick white blanket. No one was there. Her nerves were on edge as she turned away from the door. But then that feeling came again, the unsettling sensation of eyes watching her from the darkness. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as she turned toward the living room. There, standing in the corner, was a figure, a man tall and gaunt, with a face so pale it blended with the white backdrop of snow outside. His clothes were soaked, as if he had been standing in the snowstorm for hours. His eyes were empty voids, black and lifeless, staring directly at her. His lips barely moved as he whispered, "You shouldn't have come." A chill that had nothing to do with the storm washed over Emma. She stepped back, heart racing. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. He simply moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her mouth. Her body froze in place, as if the very air had turned to ice around her. He raised his hand and she noticed, his fingers were coated in frost, his skin pale and cracked like old ice. The temperature in the room dropped, the warmth from the fire evaporating as the cold seemed to bleed from his body. He reached out, touching her arm with his icy fingers. Her skin burned from the cold. Her heart raced faster than she ever thought possible. She tried to pull away, but the more she struggled, the colder she became, her body losing its warmth, her limbs stiffening. "You're not leaving," he whispered again, his voice a rasping whisper in the silence. Emma screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the cold. The fire in the hearth flickered out, leaving only darkness. The man's figure began to melt, his body dissolving into a mass of snowflakes, swirling around her like a blizzard. She tried to run, but the cabin's walls seemed to stretch and close in on her. The snow outside was creeping in, filling the windows, turning the entire room into a frozen tomb. In a final desperate attempt to escape, Emma bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. She turned to face the empty room. The figure was gone, but the frost remained. Everything she touched froze instantly, as if the entire cabin had been turned into an icebox. Suddenly, the cold was unbearable. Her fingers and toes began to freeze, her breath visible in front of her face. With each passing second, her body grew stiffer, her skin harder. The ice crept into her veins, and the last thing she saw before the frost overtook her was the snow outside, still falling, ever falling. Her body remained frozen in place, a lifeless figure, trapped in the eternal winter of the storm. Rescue workers found the cabin days later, after the storm had passed. But when they arrived, they found the door wide open, and the interior empty. The only thing left behind was Emma's frozen body, perfectly still, as if carved from snow itself. Her face was twisted in an expression of pure terror, her eyes wide open, frozen in eternal fear. Her footprints, leading into the snow, disappeared as if she had been pulled into the storm. But if you venture too close to the cabin, on a night like that, you might hear the softest knock, followed by a whisper, "You shouldn't have come." The snowstorm raged outside, cutting off all contact with the world beyond. Inside her cabin, Amelia sat by the fire, trying to shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The storm felt unnatural. And then came the knock, a soft tap on the window. A figure, covered in snow, stood outside, staring in with lifeless eyes. And as the wind howled louder, Amelia understood she had made a terrible mistake by coming here. Amelia arrived at the secluded cabin on the outskirts of the small town, excited for a weekend away from her busy life. The snowstorm had already begun, swirling around the cabin, and she thought it added to the charm. The isolation, the silence, it felt peaceful at first. But as the storm intensified, something began to feel off. The temperature inside the cabin was unnaturally cold. Amelia thought it was just the storm, but no matter how high the fire burned, the chill remained. She wrapped herself in a thick blanket, attempting to ignore the strange sensation of being watched. The wind whistled outside, and the trees outside creaked under the weight of the snow. As the night deepened, Amelia heard a sound, soft, faint, like something tapping against the window. At first, she dismissed it as the wind. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Louder, more insistent. She stood up and cautiously walked to the window. The world outside was a white blur, the snow falling in thick sheets. No one could be out there. And yet, when she looked closely, she saw a figure, standing perfectly still, covered in snow, his face barely visible under the weight of it. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, as if he were staring directly at her through the glass. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. There was no way anyone could have reached the cabin in this storm, not in the middle of nowhere. Before she could react, the figure raised his arm and pointed at her. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She turned away from the window, but the cold seemed to follow her, crawling up her spine. Suddenly, the door creaked. Amelia whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. There in the doorway stood the same figure, his face covered in snow, his eyes empty and dark. She backed away, but he didn't move, didn't speak. The air grew heavier, colder. The wind outside howled louder, like an angry beast. She could hear the man's ragged breathing, his body swaying slightly, as if frozen in place. "Who are you?" Amelia whispered, her voice shaking. His lips parted, and he spoke in a voice that wasn't his own, a low, guttural whisper, "You shouldn't have come." Before Amelia could react, the door slammed shut behind her. The storm outside seemed to intensify, and the temperature dropped even further. The man took a step forward, his snow-covered body slowly dissolving into the air, becoming part of the storm itself. Amelia tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the wind. She turned to run, but the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall of snow. The figure was standing behind her now, his face inches from hers, his breath cold as ice. "You opened the door," he whispered, his voice blending with the storm. "Now you'll never leave." When rescue workers arrived the next day, the storm had passed, and the cabin was silent. But inside, there was no sign of Amelia. Only a deep, eerie frost covering the walls. And outside, in the thick snow, her footprints led straight into the wilderness, disappearing as if she had been pulled into the storm. The storm returned that night, and the figure appeared again, watching the empty cabin from the window, waiting for the next person to wander into his trap. The howling wind outside made the cabin feel like a prison. The snowstorm was relentless, swirling around the little house in a mad frenzy. But inside, Laura felt the air grow unnervingly still. A silence that wasn't natural. She turned to the window, where snowflakes pressed against the glass as if trying to break in. Then, a soft voice, a whisper, drifted through the stillness. "Laura, come closer. Just a little closer." Laura had been driving for hours when the snowstorm started. Her car had slid on the slick roads, and she had barely managed to reach the old cabin her friend had recommended. The place looked ancient, its wooden beams darkened by years of neglect, but it had a rustic charm that was oddly welcoming. She had hoped to get some rest, to recharge from the grind of her busy life, and the isolation was just what she needed. But now, with the storm intensifying, Laura could feel her nerves fraying. She was completely alone, no cell phone signal, no neighbors for miles. The wind roared like a wild beast outside, shaking the windows of the cabin. Yet, despite the cold, the air inside the cabin felt heavy, as if something were pressing against her from all directions. She sat down on the old couch, pulling a blanket over her body, trying to distract herself with a book. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was too quiet. The storm outside raged louder with each passing minute, but inside the cabin, everything was still, too still. And then it came, the whisper. Soft at first, like a breath of wind through the cracks in the walls, but distinct enough to send a chill up Lara's spine. She froze. The whisper repeated, louder this time, as if it was right next to her ear. "Laura, come closer." Her blood ran cold. She spun around, but there was no one. Just the flickering shadows cast by the fire. The whisper continued, getting louder, more urgent. "Laura, come closer. We need you." Her heart raced. She stood up, her knees trembling. Was she imagining this? The storm outside had to be playing tricks on her mind, she thought. Maybe the wind was making those sounds, carrying voices from miles away. But as she turned to look at the windows, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The snow had stopped falling, completely. The storm had stopped. And outside, there was no sign of the raging wind or the blizzard. It was eerily calm, as if time itself had frozen. But there was something else. A figure. Standing in the distance, just beyond the edge of the cabin, barely visible in the twilight. Its outline was shrouded by the deep snow, and it appeared to be moving toward the cabin slowly, dragging something behind it. Something heavy. Lara's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She stared, transfixed by the figure, as it drew closer and closer. The figure had no face, just a dark shape, like a silhouette lost in the white wilderness. And then, as it got closer, Lara saw it more clearly. It was dragging a lifeless body, leaving a trail of blood behind it. The body was limp, pale as death, its eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. The figure stopped in front of the cabin, as if it had sensed Lara's presence. It turned, and Lara felt her entire body go cold. The air around her seemed to thicken, the room spinning. She couldn't breathe. The figure raised its hand, and Lara felt the door to the cabin slowly creak open, as if it was inviting her to step outside. With trembling hands, Lara bolted to the door, locking it tight. The whispering voice continued, louder now, as if it were right behind her. "Come closer." Lara backed away from the door, her heart hammering. She could still hear the figure, standing outside, its footsteps now growing closer, growing louder, just on the other side of the door. Her entire body was frozen in terror as the whisper became a cacophony, filling the room with 1,000 voices all calling her name. "Laura, Laura." She stumbled back, knocking over a table in the process. Her eyes darted to the window. The figure was gone, but in the place where it stood, there was a message written in blood. "Come out, Laura." Her body moved on its own, a force she couldn't control pulling her toward the door. Her hands reached for the handle before she could stop herself. The door creaked open. The figure stood there, its empty face staring at her. It didn't speak, but its eyes seemed to burn into her soul, pulling her closer, until her feet were no longer her own. The storm outside was alive now, and the snow was falling again, but thick and fast like an avalanche closing in on her. And then, as the figure reached out to touch her, its cold skeletal fingers wrapping around her wrist, everything went black. When the storm finally passed and the sun rose the next morning, the cabin was empty. The door stood wide open, and fresh footprints led out into the deep snow. But the snow, thick and deep as it was undisturbed after that. There was no sign of Laura. Only the figure, now standing in the distance, its shadow stretched long across the snow. And as it turned, you could hear the faintest whispering in the wind. "You came too close."